As we know, many tenants could not pay the rent during COVID. They either lost their jobs or got cut in pay or had new responsibilities. But fortunately, there was a moratorium on that rent. But that is going to expire in a month. And then all the back rent that they owed will be due. Now, there's good news and bad news. The good news is I worked very hard and provided New York State with $2.1 billion to go directly to tenants to help them pay the rent during COVID. The bad news is New York State has not gotten that money out to the tenants, and by September 30th, it could be risked being clawed back by the federal government. We must stop that. And today we are calling on the state of New York to get the money out to the tenants now. We have a little...
Here we can have our come up
Yes.
a little closer and a little closer because you have the signs.
We want tenant relief now. And we cannot wait any longer. The tenants need help. The moratorium is about to expire. I'd like to see it renewed, by the way, but that hasn't happened. And they could be kicked out of their homes with huge debt. Okay. So, COVID started this angst. But we in Congress, and a lot of the folks with me here today, worked very hard to see that we got rent relief. And we got a lot of money. And then we worked with a number of groups, the groups I mentioned here, to make sure that the money would go to tenants and not be diverted to other things. And we put in very good regulations. But unfortunately, New York State has not gotten the money out. As of last week, they're the only state of the 50 that had not sent any money to the tenants. Now they've sent a little trickle, but that is not enough to prevent the clawback, to prevent the people who need the money. $2.1 billion is a lot of money. And you know, when a tenant gets kicked out of their home, they have to start life all over. And what if they have kids in school? And what if they have to feed people? And what if they have to go to work? And all these other things. So this is very serious. So, let me just say a few more things. I'm not reading these wonderful notes that my staff got me. Okay. Nearly, if you think this is unusual, this affected poor people, this affected working people, this affected the middle class. Half the tenants in America missed at least one rent or mortgage payment during 2020. That amounts to nearly $6,000 in back rent for the average household, according to the Urban Institute. So that is the problem we face here. It is a very serious problem. And here in New York, those numbers are undoubtedly higher because rent is so high. The money's delivered. But instead, we say to New York State, instead of getting the money to tenants, it just sat in your pockets. And, as I said, we need the money now. We have more than 100,000 people in New York City alone who need the rent, and that's one person. They may have a family of 2, 3, or 4, so it's obviously many more than that. And there are many, thank you, Angelo, and there are people, this is not just even a city problem. Lots of people lost their jobs in the suburbs, throughout the New York area and upstate, so we need this everywhere. We may be, if the office that's supposed to do it is called the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. I never heard of that office, but they sure left a lot of people up the creek without a paddle. So we are sending a letter to them again. Hold on, or we're sending the first letter. We've sent other letters to others. I don't have the letter, right? We're sending them a letter that says one thing, very simply. Tenant relief now. The tenants desperately need it. There's no reason that they shouldn't be able to get it. The money is sitting there in the coffers of the state. With that, I will turn it over to our new, are you yet the new official head of it?
September 1st.
Our soon-to-be head of one of the great community organizations in New York, Community Voices Heard, Juanita Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Oops, sorry. Thank you, Senator Schumer. And, I mean, the senator made all the important points. Tenants need relief right now. The fact that the Office of Temporary Assistance and Disability have not sent out the money that is desperately needed across the state is unacceptable. there are millions of tenants that are at risk of not being able to pay their rent back, which leads to the fact of more people not having housing and not knowing where they're going to lay their head overnight. And then with school opening up and those in need of jobs, the last thing you want to worry about is if I'm going to be homeless, if I'm not going to have a place to live. There was a long, hard fight at the federal level to get this money for New York State. We passed a rent relief bill in New York State with a lot of the hard work that happened at the federal level and the state level with the organizations that represent Housing Justice for All. And we need to see that relief now. We don't want to see that money go back to the federal government. And then we're going to have that same problem all over again, if not magnified. So as the senator said, and like we're saying right now, tenants need relief now. So we're hoping that OTDA works with us to fix whatever systems that need to be fixed in order to get this money out for our tenants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juanita. And just one more point. We don't need a trickle of this money. A little bit came out last week. We don't need a trickle. We need a waterfall. We need it to come out fast, quick, and strong to give the tenants the relief they need. And one other point. You say, and this also can help some small landlords. Let's say you're a landlord in a two-family house. You're a hardworking person, you're a bus driver. You've got enough money, you bought a house, you have a tenant there, and the tenant can't pay for one reason or another and can't get the relief. The landlord can apply for small little landlords as well. So with that, next we're going to hear from a great organization that defends tenants with their legal might, the Legal Aid Society, led by Ellen Davidson.
Not that I lead the Legal Aid Society,
Well,
but
at this press conference.
thank you. As Senator Schumer said, we are still over a year later in the midst of a absolutely historic pandemic. For the Legal Aid Society and our clients, that pandemic led to an economic crisis that for many of them is worse than anything we saw in the 2008 Great Recession. At one point or another in the last summer, the unemployment rate in New York City was 20%. And so, of course, our clients are suffering. Low-income tenants didn't have bank accounts that they could use to pay the money once they lost their jobs. And so immediately when the pandemic started, when the economic crisis started, we reached out to Senator Schumer and our elected officials, federal elected officials, asking them to bring rent relief to New York State and to the country. And they delivered. The first tranche of money, we have $2.1 billion altogether for New York State, but New York State got its first $1.2 billion came to New York State in January because of the appropriations bill passed right around Christmas time. And immediately we went to work with our allies and tenant leaders, working with our state elected officials to create a program that would work for tenants and landlords. We created a program that would be simple and that would make it easy for tenants to apply, for landlords to apply, and money to get out. And they delivered. They delivered by creating a program with the rent relief law that should work. And then we sat and we waited for 2 months. And the program finally opened June 1st. We're now 8 weeks into the program. And it is incredibly difficult to apply. The website keeps crashing. People can't upload documents. There's no save and resume button in this application. It's 8 separate screens that people have to go through. And if anything goes wrong at any point, your application doesn't exist and you start over. Our clients, elderly, disabled, low income, limited English proficiency, cannot get through this system. We need more than money to trickle and flood and flow. We need the program to be fixed, and we are calling upon the state to use every resource every resource they have to fix the program, so that the promise that the federal government made that they would help tenants and landlords will be achieved. So please fix this program.
Thank you. And next we have Abby Ng of one of the great organizations that represents tenants and neighbors, with her Tenants and Neighbors t-shirt.
Yes. Thank you, Senator Schumer. So we work so hard, Tenants and Neighbors, Housing Justice for All, the organizations here today, we work so hard to fight for and win an historic amount of relief money for tenants. But what is the point if none of the money is getting out? As an organizer, I work with dozens of tenants who, at no fault of their own, find themselves in a position where they owe hundreds, thousands of dollars of back rent because they lost their job, they had medical bills that piled up, all of these obstacles, and now they are dependent on relief to stay in their homes. You know, they need support now. If they got through the hurdle of applying for this application, through all those screens, but they've still been left waiting for weeks without any relief, and they simply can't afford to wait. The eviction moratorium expiration is approaching, and it's so important that tenants get the relief as soon as possible. And so we ask OTDA to fix the problems, get the money out. Tenants need support. They can't wait any longer.
Thank you. Now we have two elected officials who, I started out as a tenant organizer way back when, but we have two great defenders of tenants and of helping people who need help. I'm going to do it in seniority order as opposed to size of district. Oh yes, this affects, just I understand that, this affects thousands and thousands of tenants on Long Island as well. So this is not just hundreds. Thank you, Angelo. Hundreds and hundreds of tenants on Long Island as well. So this affects the whole metropolitan area. And now we have Richard Gottfried, who is not only a leader in health, are you still head of the health? Head of the health committee, but been a great defender of tenants, and this is his district.
Well, thank you, Chuck, and thank you for bringing us together this morning. You know, OTDA says, gee, how can you criticize the way we're running the program? We've already accepted over 100,000 applications. Well, I think there are probably millions of people who need the help of this program, number one. And number two, the purpose of the program is not to accept applications. The purpose of the program is to get money out the door to tenants so that tenants can pay their rent, so that landlords can pay their expenses and mortgages. Collecting applications doesn't do the job. It's shocking how many people worked so hard in the community and in the legislature to get this program passed. People in Washington, Senator Schumer and his colleagues, sent us over $1 billion for this program, and virtually none of it has gone out the door because the administration has not been able to get their job done. You know, Governor Cuomo is fond of saying that you're not a progressive unless you can get things done. Well, it's time to get tenant relief done now. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And Brian Kavanaugh, is this your district?
No, we're a little north of my district.
This is very nearby his district in Manhattan.
Right, and thank you. I chair the Housing Committee of the Senate, and
Right, I forgot about that.
from the very beginning of this crisis, we really have been motivated by one principle, and that is that no one should lose their home because of an inability to cover their expenses because of the enormous economic disruption that we've had during COVID. So right from the very beginning, within days of the pandemic setting in New York, we pushed the courts and the governor to create a very strong eviction moratorium. As that eviction moratorium weakened at that administrative level, we passed legislation at the very end of December, right around the same time that the federal government was passing this enormous package of relief. We put a legislative moratorium in place through May 1st. As that date approached, we realized that the pandemic was still really among us and still raging throughout our state, so we extended that through August 31st. We also passed a bill called the Tenant Safe Harbor Act that says rent you have been unable to pay during COVID cannot be used as the basis for eviction.
Right.
And finally, we stepped up, again, with the tremendous leadership of Senator Schumer, which, I mean, remember, this bill was passed during a prior administration, during a divided Congress where it wasn't so easy to get rent relief on the table, but they managed to get that done and then supplemented it by doubling it very shortly after the new administration took over. we passed a law that is intended to implement that adds many additional protections for tenants. Tenants, once this money is received, won't be able to be evicted for the year after they receive the money. They can't be evicted. There are a variety of protections in the law. What we're lacking now is the implementation of this. The federal government has done its part, the legislature has done its part, and for reasons that are mystifying to many of us, the executive branch has been unable to get any of this money out the door. We hear from people constantly, and as has been noted, this is just as much about protecting small landlords who have been struggling without rent payments to pay their mortgages, to pay their taxes, to pay for their employees, to pay for the cost of managing their buildings. And this is the only way that we are going to make sure that the COVID-19 pandemic for many residents doesn't linger over them for years as a burden, as an economic burden. So again, I'm very proud of the leadership of Senator Schumer and all the great organizations that we've worked with throughout this pandemic, but we need the executive branch of the state of New York to step up and get this done. Thank you.
Everyone spoke very well. We'll now take questions from any of us on this subject. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. My main question is, what is the problem? Why is the money coming down?
Well, they haven't set it up well, and in some cases they tried to collect the money from the localities. There are a few counties upstate where they've gotten the money because those counties said we want to keep it ourselves, not send it to the state, like Monroe County, I think Erie County, Onondaga, a few, Yonkers, Hempstead, town of Hempstead. It's not a county,
But it's a big
it's
part of
800,000 people and a lot of poor people who need the help. So lots of different problems. But as of last week, 2 weeks ago, it was only New York and South Carolina that hadn't sent out any. Last week, it was only New York. Now, with a little bit of the pressure, they sent out a tiny little bit, but they got to send out a whole lot more and a whole lot more quickly.
So is it like a complicated process?
It's not a complicated. Most states, Texas, hardly a state that cares about people who need help, has sent out, I think, hundreds, some huge number,
$500 million.
$500 million. Same process. Yes, this subject.
Yes.
He likes off topics, I know.
And I have a few.
I'm sure.
You're not surprised. To the Assemblyman, the Senator, are there any rumblings about extending the moratorium beyond August 31st?
Well, that's federal. Yeah, go ahead.
So the moratorium in New York State, which again goes well past what the CDC did, it's really a blanket moratorium that prevents cases from even being initiated. It has been primarily justified as a public health measure. We looked at the rates of COVID community transmission at the end of April and the beginning of May. It was still rated as high in virtually every county in the state, and so we've extended that moratorium. Making the case for that will depend on the state of COVID when we get toward the end of August. But the critical thing is that our first line of defense at this point ought to be getting this money into people's hands. So there's not a question of eviction. The landlord has been paid. The tenant has been relieved of the anxiety of that growing rent burden. And that I think that's what we're focused on at this point.
Still the potential for it.
It's theoretically, we will look at it. Both houses of the legislature will be looking at it. But, I think there are no guarantees about that. We also, I should note, both houses of the legislature will be holding hearings on this subject in the coming weeks.
Other questions on this subject? Okay, we'll take one or two off topics, but you don't get the first one. Anyone else? Well, you may get the first one. Go ahead. He's a very good, diligent fellow.
So diligent.
What are the prospects for a vote on the infrastructure package this week?
Look, the bottom line is we're working hard on both parts. Progress is being made on both parts. And of both the bipartisan bill and the reconciliation bill. On both parts, there are several outstanding issues, so stay tuned.
So nothing on Monday?
Stay tuned.